how does a democracy really die? We tend to picture something spectacular, a sudden coup, tanks rolling through the Capitol. But what if history shows us the end is, well, usually quieter? What if the actual death is slow and legal, meticulously constructed from the inside? That subtle erosion of norms, that's the core theme we are unpacking today. And we want you to enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis. It's more than just a summary, though we do include that too. This feature examines how an author shapes their argument, how they build influence, and earn or lose your trust. It's designed to give you the tools to read with sharper insight. Should you read this book, this should help. It's also, I think, excellent for aspiring writers. And if you find this format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback really does guide our future content.
So we are diving deep into How Democracies Die. The authors are Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. And these are two leading Harvard political scientists. They've spent decades researching this exact topic, democratic breakdown. And they've essentially translated all that dense academic work into a really clear, compelling warning for a general audience. The book's timing was critical. It came out shortly after a major U.S. election that, well, it raised a lot of global concerns. And they framed the election of Donald Trump not as some unique one-off event,
but as a pattern.
Exactly. A recognizable pattern they've seen across Latin America and interwar Europe.
Yeah.
They position themselves less as pundits and more as expert guides.
That context is everything. And before we really get into the mechanisms they describe, we should acknowledge something about how we're doing this. You're experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for a deeper, more dynamic book analysis. Okay, so let's unpack their core thesis. It's this historically grounded warning about the slow, legalistic death of democratic norms. They're trying to persuade elites and citizens to strengthen what they call the soft guardrails of the system.
Right. The core idea is that democracies today don't die in a big revolution.
They die by 1,000 small legal cuts.
And they establish their authority, their ethos right away. You feel their decades of research. The book's whole logic is built on translating this really complex institutional behavior into simple concepts.
And the tone is so important there. It's calm, it's analytic. It avoids hyperbole.
Which is what gives their warning so much weight. They want to reach people across the political spectrum, people who just have a basic commitment to the system itself.
That scholarly approach is key, because the whole argument really hangs on 4 specific terms. These are the vocabulary you need to diagnose the threats yourself.
Exactly. The first, and maybe the one they see most often, is constitutional hardball.
Constitutional hardball. So using the rules as a weapon.
Precisely. It's the practice of pushing legal or institutional tactics to their absolute limit. It's technically allowed by the rules, but it completely breaks the spirit of democratic norms.
Can you give us a concrete example, maybe something from outside the recent American context?
Oh, absolutely. Think about Alberto Fujimori in Peru back in the 1990s. Now, he eventually did stage an outright self-coup, but his early tactics, textbook constitutional hardball, he was stacking the judiciary, shutting down Congress, using referendums, all of it had this veneer of legality, but he was systematically dismantling any check on his power.
Using the Constitution to kill the Constitution. Okay, that makes perfect sense. So the second concept is what they propose as the preventative measure for that. It's called gatekeeping.
Yes, and gatekeeping is this vital responsibility that lies with party elites. The leaders, the established members, their job is to filter out and prevent authoritarian-leaning politicians from rising in the first place.
So it's an institutional decision.
It is. It's the party saying, this person is a threat to the system, and we will not nominate them. We won't support them. We'll actively campaign against them, even if they're popular.
They use the Republican Party's historical treatment of someone like David Duke as an example of that, right?
A perfect example of successful gatekeeping, yes. The party establishment worked actively to exclude someone they saw as fundamentally anti-democratic.
That feels like a very high bar today, though. With so much polarization, the line between a political difference and an existential threat gets blurry.
It absolutely is. And that leads right into the 2 unwritten rules they say are the soft guardrails of any healthy democracy. The first one is mutual toleration.
The idea that your opponents are just rivals, not mortal enemies.
Precisely. It's the informal understanding that you accept your political rivals as legitimate opponents. You might disagree with them, profoundly, but you don't treat them like traitors or criminals who need to be locked up to save the country.
If you lose that, you lose the basis for a peaceful transition of power.
You've lost the foundation.
And that brings us to the last one, Forbearance, which I find the most interesting. It's almost an act of humility.
It is. It's the norm of self-restraint. It means that you don't use the absolute maximum of your legal power, even when you technically could. For instance, a president might have the legal power to pack the Supreme Court, but they hold back.
Right.
For the sake of institutional stability, that self-restraint is central to their whole theory.
So you have these four concepts: hardball, gatekeeping, toleration, and forbearance as the building blocks.
Yeah.
And the way they built the book, the very structure of it, reinforces this idea that these problems are universal.
That's right. The structure is a persuasive tool in itself. It moves from diagnosis to comparative evidence and then to prescription. That progression is designed to move you, the reader, from recognizing the danger to realizing that, well, that you have some agency, that this isn't inevitable.
And the main rhetorical strategy to do that is analogy. They just systematically refuse to treat the U.S. as exceptional.
The United States is constantly compared to other struggling democracies.
Right, in America, interwar Europe.
Right. And it normalizes the idea that the U.S. is ordinary enough to be vulnerable to the same diseases. It's a direct challenge to American exceptionalism.
It's like they use those foreign case studies, 1930s Italy, contemporary Venezuela, as a screen. You can see the danger over there first.
And then apply the pattern back to your own context. It makes the self-diagnosis a little less politically charged.
Wait, but comparing the U.S. to 1930s Germany or Venezuela, this sounds pretty extreme. Doesn't that risk making it all sound like hyperbole?
It's a risk, but they ground it by focusing on the mechanisms of breakdown, which they argue are shockingly consistent. And one of the most dangerous mechanisms they highlight is this idea of fateful alliances.
Ah, yes. We should define that.
A fateful alliance is when established democratic elites, usually from the center-right, team up with an authoritarian populace from the fringe.
To defeat a common enemy, like a socialist movement.
Exactly. They think they can control the populace, but what happens is they legitimize them. They empower the very figure who ends up dismantling the system they wanted to save.
A powerful and recurring historical lesson. And the book's structure just hammers this home with what you call a looping structure.
Precisely. A chapter will pose a concept, like fateful alliances. Then it brings in the evidence Turkey, Hungary, Venezuela. And then, crucially, it circles right back to the American context. It builds this cumulative sense of a pattern, not just a bunch of one-off stories.
That repetition of cases and the clear declarative prose makes it all stick. You read about Hungary's court packing, and you remember it when they're talking about constitutional hardball. It shifts the argument from this happened once to this is how it works.
They also use these simple typologies, almost like diagnostic checklists, for identifying authoritarians.
Which empowers the reader. It translates the research into something you can actually use to see the warning signs. It puts the power of diagnosis in your hands.
And if you are finding this kind of expanded analysis valuable, the kind that digs into the architecture of an argument, our YouTube channel offers AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques, all to inspire reflection and rational thought.
Let's turn to the emotional side of the book, the pathos. They use these vivid historical vignettes, purges of courts, media crackdowns. It definitely creates a sense of unease, but they are so careful to avoid sensationalism. They're not trying to cause a panic.
The emotional arc is very purposeful. It's designed to shift you from shock that, yes, democracies can die slowly, to a sense of urgency, a feeling that the U.S. is showing familiar warning signs. And then finally, it lands on conditional hope.
Right, because they argue norms and gatekeeping can be rebuilt.
Which prevents the whole thing from just collapsing into despair.
I think their most potent move, though, is this norm-centered stance. The argument that the unwritten guardrails are just as important as the Constitution's text.
It's a brilliant framing.
It lets them criticize behavior that is technically legal, but still corrosive to democratic culture. It reframes the debate away from, is this legal, to, is this restrained?
And even though they clearly critique specific people, the tone stays so sober and analytic, it's not a polemic.
Which is smart. It's how you persuade hesitant centrists or readers from other political camps who might otherwise just shut down.
In terms of effectiveness, the book is brilliant at translating this dense research. It gives readers specific things to watch: party recruitment, institutional restraint, not just a vague feeling of anxiety.
But we do have to talk about the limitations, the things critics often point to.
Absolutely. Focusing on elites and norms is powerful, but it can obscure other huge structural forces.
Like?
Well, like widening economic inequality, for one. That fuels the resentment that populism feeds on. Or the fragmented media ecosystem we all live in now. The book doesn't focus on those as much.
So if the book's answer is, elites need to act responsibly. What happens when the underlying conditions make that almost impossible? When the rewards all go to antagonism and hardball?
Exactly. And another critique is that by holding up the past consensus as this ideal, the book can idealize a political system that historically excluded a lot of people.
Marginalized groups, yeah. The good old days of cooperation weren't always good for everyone.
Right. So that shapes who feels fully addressed. But even with that, it remains just a phenomenal diagnostic tool.
So what's the big takeaway for you? The value of How Democracies Die is how it reshapes the way you think about democratic threats. It's not about bullets. It's about elite behavior and those informal norms. It gives you a vocabulary and a toolkit to watch for those slow, legalistic deaths.
And that leaves us with the final provocative thought. Since the book puts so much responsibility on elites to be gatekeepers, what happens when the gatekeepers themselves are the ones abandoning the guardrails for their own gain? How does the responsibility of an ordinary citizen shift then? Can grassroots movements ever truly replace elite gatekeeping? That's something for you to mull over.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary. Subscribe, share, purchase via the link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.